people are coming in, sitting down, I appreciate that. We'll go ahead and we'll get started here. This is Evelsizer. He's with the Wildlife Research Section of the Iowa DNR. He's a wetland biologist and fur bearer biologist. Previously has monitored wetlands in the water monitoring section for 7 years. He's going to talk to us about drain wetlands in waterfall.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here and excited to talk about this project. So right now, about half my job is with wetlands. The other half of my job is with fur bearers. So that's like mink, muskrat, beaver, and all that. We watch population trends and harvest and disease and that kind of thing. In addition to that, the last few years, part of the job maybe has become working with large predators as well. So that's mountain lions, wolves, and black bears. So it's an interesting job. It's not boring so far. That's for sure. So today I wanted to, oh, wait. Different project. Just kidding. We don't stock mountain lions in Iowa. That's not a doctored picture, of course, either. One thing that's a little different with this project and getting started to understand is that it did not look at our existing wetlands. It looked at the other 90% of the wetlands in our state. Looking at existing wetlands, monitoring existing wetlands is, of course, very important, but also looking at the other part of the story, the drained wetlands as well is important too. So that's kind of what this project wanted to get at. So just to be clear, we're talking about the basins that are naturally there that were formed glacially 10 to 12,000 years ago up in north central Iowa. They're so well drained now that most folks in Iowa, it's basically altered beyond recognition. I love this picture. I use it frequently, I will admit, because I think it really shows or tells a story. This rain was a 5-inch rain that came in late May, just prior to the crops, sprouting and taking off. And it came fast enough and hard enough that it basically backed up the tile for a couple of days. And you could just get a glimpse of what it used to look like up there. So in getting this into the farm wetland project, some background to remember is that at least 90% of Iowa's wetlands are drained and farmed annually. Most of that has drain tile under it. Most of it is farmed for corn and beans intensively. These wetlands hold water pretty much nowadays only when there's enough rainwater or snow melt to back up the tile for a while. And I guess what was interesting to me is that over the last 80 to 100 years, there's not that much information available, about drained wetlands in Iowa anyway. So it was something we really wanted to look at because it's important. It's important because for a variety of reasons, primarily the economics, the intensity of land use, and what it means to the environment, wetland-wise, water quality-wise, and wildlife-wise. So we were lucky to get a couple grants from US EPA. It was a 4-year project from 2011 to 2014. Project coordination was done through the Iowa DNR, but we also worked with partners. It was more of a team effort, and those partners were Iowa State University and the State Hygienics Lab. So the objectives were to simply, start to get a better understanding and to document more information related to drained farmed wetlands by simply collecting some data on what we felt were some important components to get more information on. And those included water quality, surface water quality, and below ground water quality as well. And hydrology, the interactions of these wetland basins that are out there and existing with the drain tile, precipitation, snow melt, and connectiveness to each other, and to the watershed in general. And then of course to us, what our primary interest was from the wildlife side was what, if any, value is there to wildlife year in and year out? Is there any at all, and if there is, to what extent and for which suite of critters? So we chose to focus on water birds, migratory water birds primarily, and herps, reptiles, amphibians, that sort of thing. To back up a little bit, the part that we were looking at in Iowa belongs to a much bigger part in North America known as the prairie popple region. I imagine a lot of you are familiar with that, but it's something to kind of keep in mind here scale-wise. So we're at the far southern end of the prairie popple region, which is an entire region of glacially formed popple wetlands. And it's known to many as the duck factory of North America. It's really important vital nesting breeding grounds for not only ducks, but a lot of other shorebirds and grassland nesting birds as well. And because it sets in the north central part of North America, it's under, there's pressures all the way up into Alberta about how to use that landscape. So our study focused on that southern lobe, the Des Moines lobe, southern portion of the prairie popple region. What we try to do here with our study design, where do you start? A little bit here. There's so many acres. It's estimated there's 3.8 to 4 million hydric soils or wetlands that were originally there in a 25 to 30 county area of Iowa. So what we try to do is stratify by hucks in the north to south direction there, and we try to pick rural townships in those hucks that were not going to be entirely influenced by city, and hard structure. So we tried to keep it out in the ag fields and the ag lands as much as we could. So we had 8 townships from north to south there. So the field work, because of time, I won't go into every gory detail on our field work part, but just understand we did a lot of surveying and sampling basically to get the information. Private land was accessed only after receiving permission, of course, so it was voluntary. I just like these pictures here. This picture here is what a lot of our seasonals saw just before the dog tore off their leg as they opened the car. It was the last thing they saw. I'm just kidding. Property respect, talking to the landowners was taken seriously. We had a success rate of about 75% with access onto private land in those townships when we selected the tract of land that had the basins we were looking for. So we felt like we had good success because we went there and talked to them in person. Keep in mind, you're covering 8 townships throughout this whole area. These people are often not home during the day. They're working day jobs and then farming, in the evenings and weekends, or they're absentee landowners, that kind of thing. So it sometimes took repeated visits. Then we would explain the project, what we were going to do. We'd give them a summary and just talk with them for a long time because they often had a lot of questions. Some did, some didn't care. Not surprising. But it was one of the more fun aspects of the project. So the first component with this project I want to get into is the component number 1, the wildlife values. Our partners with the water bird use was Steve Densmore, Iowa State University professor, and his graduate student, Kevin Murphy. With the herp use, Karen Kincaid with the wildlife diversity program with the Iowa DNR. And then we also looked at macro inverts when we could, and Dave Hoffman and myself and our field crew looked at that. I'm going to talk a little bit about water birds here first. The basic field methods were, it was basically roadside surveys, transects, a lot of driving on standardized transects throughout the township. The idea with that is that you could cover more ground efficiently by staying in your vehicle and just, viewing things from the window and not spooking the birds any more than possible. In 2012, 2 more townships were added as they got going with the project and could see what they could swing time-wise. So they actually did 10 townships from 2012 to 2014. So they were conducted on 4-day intervals each year, regardless of the weather. So they would document the wetlands that were holding ponding water when they did that. So they classified by size, avian species observed, and the abundance. This is just a visual, I guess, of a couple of townships. I don't know if can you guys see that bright green was their transect routes that they drove. 72-mile transects. And so this was driven, these transects were driven during the spring to coincide with migration, March through May, June. So there was a lot of variation in what they saw out there. There's a lot of open ag fields is the main thing they saw, but there was a lot of variation in the surface water. Some of the basic results, we anticipated there would be weather variation. That was part of why we wanted it to be more than a 1 or 2 year study. And sure enough, there was. We secured the first grant with the EPA, and right out of the gate in 2011 and 2012, it was pretty dry. There was fairly normal precip in the early spring in 2011, but then it quickly dried up after that. 2012, in the spring it was still very dry. So it's pretty hard, you're not going to see too much out there, whether you're water sampling or bird sampling when it's that dry. That's how it goes. But we were able to get a second grant and continue this a couple more years, and fortunately things got better. It got wet out there to normal again. So there was some good ponding that went on, and the results kind of show that, what happens, the response here. The bird response, there was moderate diversity in numbers of both waterfowl and shorebirds, but they were mostly gone by mid-May. In 2012, there were some decent waterfowl numbers right after spring snowmelt, and then a few birds thereafter. And that was because of the dryness. 2013 and 14, there was excellent diversity in numbers of both waterfowl and shorebirds out there when those wetlands held water. So this is just a basic table that Steve and Kevin provided that shows a breakdown, comparison of waterfowl species, waterfowl numbers, the second row there. Look at the waterfowl numbers response there in 2013 and 2014 compared to 2012 there. So it's a really dynamic deal, flashy. Some years there's not much water and therefore not many birds. Shorebirds and waterfowl are extremely adept at detecting the presence of water as they're moving northward in the spring and keying in on it and taking advantage of it when they can. So this just kind of helped document that. In addition, we were lucky to have the chance, Kevin Murphy tried to take advantage of the fall migration, which actually starts occurring in August and goes through September for several of our shorebirds that are on a long migration from the far north to the far south. One of the bird species they found in the fall using these muddy shallow water basins was pectoral sandpipers. So what they did is they captured them in mist nets and put radio transmitters on them for a while to watch and observe how long these birds stayed in Iowa and utilize these drain farm wetlands. And while they had the bird in the hand, they took body mass measurements, and just assessed these birds. And it was really interesting, some of the dietary, physiological things they observed too. I won't go into that as much, but there was birds that were healthy and fat, and there was birds that were a little thinner and not so healthy. So some of the takeaways with that pectoral sandpiper transmitter work was that the average stopover length was about 7.5 days that they stayed in Iowa. The stopover length decreased toward the end of the season. Decreased when birds had more body fat reserves, which is intuitive and makes sense, right? They don't need to stay and fuel up and rest. If they're in good shape, they can move on quicker. Okay, the other aspect of wildlife sampling was we spent a lot of time, our crew spent a lot of time walking around in muddy wetlands looking for herps. We really thought there might be some salamander, frog, toad use out there going on in them when we started this project. But we also knew it would be a race against time whether they could pull off any kind of life cycle in there with laying eggs and raising tadpoles and that kind of thing. What we found after we did was a lot of visual encounter surveys. We walked the wetted perimeter of these wetland basins, and then we walked transects through the wetland basins. Oftentimes it was, just stubble, mud out there that you're walking through. The field crews did a great job of hanging in there and staying patient with this. It was not the most glamorous part of the job. Sometimes it was hot, or deep, deeper water, that kind of thing. We did find some American toad out there, some chorus frogs, but we really didn't find too much else. But that's also important to document, that we didn't see some of that other stuff that like we thought we might. We didn't really see much for salamanders. And oftentimes with the toads and the chorus frogs, if there was ponded water there for multiple days, they would try to breed in there, lay eggs, and tadpoles would come off, but we very seldom saw a complete cycle successfully make it through where they metamorphed into adults, suggesting that these are sink, areas. But in general, after a lot of hours spent doing this, they're not being used that much by reptiles and amphibians. One of the things that was really interesting that we didn't have a lot of invested into on this particular project at this time was measuring a lot with macro-inverts. They're an interesting, important thing to do. But so what I have are just some observation results here. What we noticed is after the drain farm wetlands, if it got wet, like in 2013-14 when it ponded water, some of these basins held water for 10, 12 days. If they held water that long, all of a sudden we found life out there in the water. And what we found was really pretty neat. It was these fairy shrimp. And then the middle picture there, the tadpole shrimp. Anybody ever seen a tadpole shrimp in Iowa? I never had. Yeah, I bet you have. So, I mean, they're pretty neat looking. If you can see there on the measurement board, those things are 2.5 centimeters long. That's a good inch long. That's big for an invertebrate. That's a macroinvertebrate, and I don't know, it's pretty neat, life on Mars. So, and then there's also clam shrimp. So, and there would be a few other things, back swimmers and stuff like that, but the deal is with that is those eggs were likely in those basins from possibly 50 to 80 years ago, and that was a functioning wetland, is what we're thinking. And after all that intensive disruption and stuff, they're still able to hatch when the conditions were right. So since these are not a fully functioning wetland, it's basically a mud puddle out there that's predator-free. So if they hatched, they did okay because they often didn't get hammered by some predator that often lives in a regularly functioning wetland. However, that may be some of the reasons we're seeing shorebird and waterfowl usage in these wetlands too, is because there might be a pretty important food source in them when the conditions are right. We didn't see those in every wetland, it just had to be the ones that ponded water long enough. Component number 2 was the hydrological part. Keith Schilling was mainly the team member in charge of that component. It was not me. I don't claim to be a hydrologist, so I'll try to do it justice here. But it was a really important part to have with this project. I learned a lot with it. He put in some shallow wells, groundwater monitoring wells in several of these basins. These are his well locations that coincided with our wildlife and water quality sites. So these occurred in the same 8 townships that we did our parks in. Those are some stratigraphy details in those sites there. It's probably a little hard to read. But there were some different types of soil and such in each of those basins, and the drainage situation was a little different in them. So one of the takeaways from his work, there's quite a few things to take away from his work, like each of the components, but with time here, I just wanted to show you on each of these is one of the sites where you had a well, each one of those boxes. And then that's the line right here on each one of those, that's the surface level, the ground surface there. So you can see there, typically March through June, July, we would get some spikes where that groundwater table would get up above and become visible above ground there on it. But then, after a few weeks, it would drop back down to a base level where the drain tile was. Very flashy. These are some of the basic results he had from the 2011 to 2013 work. He, obviously was able to record things from the wells, anything from temperature to below ground depth, conductance, and then a couple things to point out over there that are interesting is nitrogen. Nitrates were fairly high, especially in 2013-14 after the dry weather we'd had for a while. You can see some means. The mean over there for nitrates, 15.61. Pretty high. Not surprising, good to document. And Keith has quite a bit more on that will be, we're at a point now where we're working up our final reports and manuscripts on it. So that was just something I wanted to show you, though. It's pretty interesting. Component number 3 was the surface water sampling part of this project. Dave Hoffman, a guy that works with me up there in the Clear Lake office, our field crew and myself worked on this component. So we did, I guess you could say, the regular suite of testing. We sampled for the N series, P series, and then a lot of herbicides and some insecticides and things, contaminants or analytes. Some of the basics with what we found, what we did with our sampling was we tried to sample, funding-wise, budget-wise, it's expensive to sample for these things. So we were able to sample, if the weather permitted, 3 rounds of sampling at least 2 wetlands in each of the 8 townships. So a typical one round of sampling would be around 16 wetlands for that round. 3 times throughout the spring and the early summer. You can see there the number of analytes tested in 2014 jumped up a couple because of just some testing for 2 reasons. We were able to sample for neonicotinoids or neonics in 2014, and then SHL, the State Hygienic Lab, just had the ability to add in a couple more analytes. That wasn't going to cost anymore. Some of the basic takeaways with the preliminary results so far is that in 2013, when we had good water, you could get out there and sample surface water. 39 of the 76 analytes, there was noticeable or measurable detections. In 2014, there was 42 of the 66. The table here just shows some of the top offenders, I guess you could say, or the top analytes that showed up the most with the highest levels. So in past wetland monitoring experience I had, and I think other surface water monitoring, is kind of the same ones where it's some of these leading herbicides that show up, as well as atrazine and that sort of thing. The max concentration is the last column over there. Notice that some of the maxes there, the level of them, are pretty high. The mean is pretty high too. The acetochlor, atrazine, the mean concentration is right up there. Not surprising, but it's good to document that. It's also good to document what wasn't detected out there as well. So. I wanted to just show a little bit here, what's interesting temporally is we typically, this bar graph here just simply shows the mean concentration of analytes detected, excluding nutrients per round from 2012 and 2013 data. The blue bars there is 2012 data, 2013 is the red bars. So in the earlier part of the spring, in this case, it would be late April or early May, concentrations were a little lower, and then they would spike up pretty high in late May and June. With the nutrients, we found, nitrate levels were quite high, and we also, sampled for orthophosphorus and total phosphorus as well. But nitrogen was, of course, the highest one out there, which makes sense with it being easily mobile with water. I wanted to chat a bit about neonics. Here's some basic information on the concentrations from 48 wetlands sampled in 2014. So as you might recall, we were able to sample for neonics in 2014 only, but we were happy to be able to work that in this past field season and check out what might be present out there in those wetlands. 3 of the 7 types of neonics were found. Clethnidin, I don't know if I got that right with pronunciation, was the most common one found out there in 47 of the 48 wetlands. It was found at detectable levels. The mean concentration was 0.31 there micrograms per liter. But there was also 4 varieties that weren't detected out there, at least in the spring sampling. The temporally, again, we found concentrations of neonics went up there in late May and June. I would guess that coincided with planting. So in general, concentrations, number of detects is lower in the early spring, and then it went up in the May and June. Detects and concentrations went up. I just wanted to end here with this slide again, a couple of takeaways from it. I think step back and look at this landscape. It's a part of Iowa. It's important for a lot of reasons. It's the headwaters for a lot of our major rivers. This project is not something land managers can do, grasp, and it's not a project necessarily for a wildlife manager or something, that they're going to find all that useful where they can apply something here. But I think the importance of this project was it's almost more important for policymakers, administrators, and that sort of thing, to just understand that there's a little more information out there available about this type of wetland now, and hopefully it can be used a little bit for policy, related decisions about this important landscape. Thanks. Yeah, a few of them did. A few of them we had long conversations. They were very interested and very astute on nutrients and what might be out there on the landscape and concern. So if they asked, we would send them a summary report. It's something we often did with our past wetland monitoring too. We try to leave our contact info too, and if there was troubles with, if they had any concerns with anything they saw, or perceived us doing out there. We always walk out onto their property and that kind of thing, but most of them, though, I would say more than 2/3 didn't care to see a report. We're going to try to do a couple manuscripts and a final report and share this information as it gets finalized. Yeah.
So you're doing your report, and what's the take-home of this project? Would you think that you have enough information to take some of our production or to select some of the features that are worth preserving, or what's what guys want?
A couple things.
Could you repeat that question?
I think she's saying, what gives or what could come of this. What is our hopes of how the results would be used? Is that right? Okay. Couple things, again, I hope it simply provides some documented science-based data and information about this landscape. The other important thing too to remember is these basins are still out there, and the neat thing about them is they can be restored. And these kind of Tadpole wetlands, as well as other wetlands, riverine wetlands, what have you, can all play a role in, you know, flood attenuation, critical wildlife habitat, and our water quality, whether that's surface water or below, you know, subsurface water. So yeah, I mean, I think though.
Do you think you guys had enough information to prove that it's worth conserving, or?
I think it's the beginning of some good information. I'm hoping it gets used or appreciated. We'll see. I think there's a lot more to study and learn with it though too. It's a fascinating topic. Actually, I wasn't sure it would be when we first started.
Miss, will you be here for a while yet?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, lunch is waiting. I really appreciate it. Really doing everybody.